Tonight's story takes us to a dark chapter in a city's past, with a tale so disturbing it was buried for years. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. This story is graphic, unsettling, and not for the faint of heart. For those who choose to stay, maybe keep a light on and be warned. Once you hear the end of this story, you'll never look at certain things the same way again. So, settle in, get cozy, and enjoy. As a journalist, there are lots of things that we write which end up never making it to publishing. This can be for many reasons. Maybe the editor didn't like something in it. Maybe it was just a bad article, or maybe someone in a position of authority didn't want it printed. Many years ago, I found yet another reason for a story to get buried. I couldn't bring myself to write it. It was in the 1980s that I was doing a patrol car ride-along with two officers I will call Mike and Dave. Mike was a 5-year veteran, and Dave had been a traffic cop for a year and was still as green as a bunch of bananas. I was doing a series of stories at the time about the struggles of the police against the rising epidemic of drugs. After interviewing a half-dozen police officers, Mike offered to have me come along on his patrol. Of course, he couldn't promise me I'd get to see anything interesting. After riding in the car for 4 hours, I was ready to fall asleep in the back of the car. Between the setting summer sun baking me in the back seat of the car and the constant dry humor Dave was dishing out, I was damn near ready to blow my brains out. Every time I started to make a note to myself on my cassette recorder, I was interrupted by some horrible pun or tiresomely witty anecdote. Finally, to my great relief, we got the first and only radio call of the day about something other than some senile woman in a fender bender or a John taking a piss in view of an overprotective mother. There was a single gunshot reported on a street only 3 minutes away. This was the kind of thing I had been waiting for. By the time we arrived, the last crimson haze of the sun was disappearing over the man-made horizon. The streets were dead quiet, as a gunshot has the tendency to disperse people rather than gather them. Most were still peeking from shuttered windows and from behind their cars, not wanting to risk a stray bullet for the sake of rubbernecking. The origin of the gunshot was apparently a small, hole-in-the-wall butcher's, and our car was the first to arrive. I'll be honest, I was partly hoping to bide my time in the car and ask questions later. I was, and still am not, a huge fan of guns. You can imagine how my heart sank then, when Mike motioned for me to get out of the car. A portly neighbor woman was talking with them, and explained that she had heard a loud noise from inside the butcher's, which she presumed was a gun. She kept going on about how much she hated the owner for always playing loud music and having an illegally noisy air conditioning unit. She looked like the type of woman that would call a slamming door a gunshot. The store's windows were unlit, and in the front a definitive closed sign hung behind an unyielding glass door. At this point I was told to stay put, while Mike and Dave went around back. I faintly heard yells of "police" and some other cliché noises from deep inside, followed by silence. If there was a perpetrator of some crime, they were likely long gone. A minute later, Mike walked out from behind the counter and unlocked the door from the inside. I followed behind the two of them as they searched every room. The hardwood floor gave off a sheen of light and must have been mopped and waxed recently. The shelves and machinery were immaculate. One wouldn't have known this was a butcher's shop at all, if not for the meats adorning the cold case. But there was an off-putting smell that seemed to get stronger towards the back of the store. We commented on it to each other, but couldn't locate the source. Dave thought it was a dead body, but if someone had just died, that wouldn't make any sense. After searching the last room and finding nothing, we headed to the second floor. The upstairs layout was in 2 halves on either side of a set of wooden stairs. On one half, there was a giant refrigeration unit with one of those shunts that takes the exhaust air up to a vent on the roof. The other half was a combination living space and office. There was a dirty bed covered in brown and red stains, and a small desk with an open leather tool bag laid out. There was a cold chill wafting through the room, and the sound of the refrigeration unit was so loud we had to yell just to hear each other. Dave yelled something and motioned towards the refrigerator. The cold breeze in the air was from the door to the refrigeration unit being left half open. A dim orange beam of light flooded out onto the floor, revealing a dark red pool of still-drying blood. Mike, who had put his gun away earlier, once again pulled it out. Dave had never put his away and was still holding it with both hands pointed up at the ceiling, like he was about to use it to chop wood. They did some hand signals to each other on either side of the door before Dave swung it open with one hand, while Mike jumped inside and shouted something along the lines of, "Police, freeze!" Some part of me skeptically believed that his choice of words was unintentional. There was no gunshot, which was good, but Mike didn't say anything or come back out. Dave was still waiting to follow Mike in, and I was even farther away from the door, hoping that whatever they found was worthy of a day of being crammed a sweltering hot car. Mike suddenly came tumbling out of the door, fell down, and started scrambling backwards. He had dropped his gun and had an expression on his face like he had seen a ghost. He seemed to not even notice that he was sitting down in the pool of blood, or that his arms were involuntarily clawing at the ground to move him backwards even farther. His mouth kept opening and closing, like a fish out of water. I saw Dave peek his head around the corner into the refrigerator. As he stuck his head around, he froze in place with his revolver pointing down at the floor. Whatever he saw made his trigger finger involuntarily pull. I watched it happen in slow motion. It made a big click sound, and if the primer hadn't been a dud, he probably would have blown a hole in his foot, or at the very least the floorboards. He didn't even notice that he had tried to fire his gun. Mike and Dave both started mumbling and then yelling gibberish, not to each other, but to themselves. Dave was throwing up vomit onto the floor, and Mike was saying something incomprehensible into his radio with his eyes closed. I couldn't help myself. I looked into the meat locker as well. It is a decision that I have always regretted. At first, I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. My peripheral vision saw some animal carcasses hanging in rows. Nothing out of place in a butcher's meat locker. They were mostly skinned and most likely being hung to age the meat, a practice I was not too familiar with, but had heard about from my friends who hunt deer. Most of the carcasses just looked like big piles of muscles and sinew. My immediate attention was drawn to the body on the ground. It was a middle-aged man, probably in his late 40s, lying next to a bowl-shaped chunk of scalp and flecks of gray matter like cotton candy on the floor. Laying down next to it was another body, a young man, no older than 20. He still had his fingers wrapped around a small pistol, the all-black kind with a short barrel and a box magazine. There was a pile of something under him, which took me a second to process was his intestines. He had been disemboweled. The long, thin, gutting knife lay right there beside him on the floor. It was a ghastly scene, and my brain simply could not process what it was seeing. I imagine that I, too, started to spew gibberish at this point, but I cannot recall. Had the boy shot the man? Had the man disemboweled the boy? I could not tell exactly what chain of events could have led to the scene that lay sprawled out before me. That's when I looked up again and felt the devil himself reach into my soul. The carcasses I had seen hanging when I first looked inside were not what I thought they were. My brain played a trick on me when I first saw them and told myself that it was just meat and nothing out of the ordinary. 30 human bodies hung in rows by the flesh of their collarbones. Their eyelids and lower jaws were removed, their tongues hanging down like red ribbons from what could no longer be called faces. Some had been there so long that the meat had separated from the bones completely, their bare yellow collarbones hanging under a foot gap between the skin on the meat hooks. Some were skinned, some were missing arms or legs. Everywhere I looked there was the yellow-white tint of rotting sinews, exposed joints, and dull gray rotting meat that had long since lost its blood. The corpse in front was a woman who had been skinned all the way up to her neck. Her cloudy eyes looked right through me. Their faces were all pointed towards the door, like a family of mannequins in a department store window. The dim orange light of the room pulsated as they swung back and forth from the wind of the air conditioner. It felt as if the chains that bound them were the only thing to keep them from floating towards me like vengeful apparitions. In that moment, the human body became meat to me. I could never look at a naked woman again without reliving that scene. A tall mirror stood in front of a wooden chair behind the body of the young man on the ground. That's when I realized what the mirror was for and why they were missing their eyelids. He made them watch. I stood there, frozen in shock, unable to process what I was seeing. I only snapped out of it when police officers flooded the place, and one of them began pushing me out. It felt like he was moving a lifeless sack of bones. I was numb, speechless, thoughtless, with only the grotesque image burned into my mind. I didn't fully come to until I was back in the patrol car, where an officer instructed me to stay still and wait. A lot of things happened after that. The bodies were put into boxes and moved into a mobile refrigeration truck. The whole thing was cleaned up so fast by the police that the press never got wind of it. I was told not to say anything about what I had seen for the sake of the families and because it could compromise any investigation into accomplices. Later on, I heard that some of the bodies were identified as missing persons, their families contacted, and that was the last I ever heard of it. Some of the meat from the small refrigerator in the front was tested. The cuts were all what their label said, but all of the sausages contained human protein. As much as I tried to forget about the whole thing for a long time, I could not take the picture of bodies hanging in that refrigerator room out of my mind. I found myself drinking heavily, spiraling down a path of self-destruction. One night I ran into Mike, one of the patrol officers who had been there with me that night. He didn't look much better than I did. I could tell the horrific scene had taken a toll on him too. Over a few drinks, he opened up and shared more of what he knew. I guess he just wanted to talk to someone. The butcher's victims, he said, were from neighboring districts. He did his abducting far from his store and ferried his unconscious victims home, presumably, in the back of his truck. Almost all the people who were identified were last seen leaving bars very late at night. Some of the bodies had massive blunt trauma to the skull, but others had none. Perhaps he had started using sedatives or some other method of knocking out victims. The butcher had 2 daughters that refused to believe he was a murderer. They described him as a normal, loving father. Worst part? He had won awards 2 years in a row for his sausages, God know what made of. Most people will never know what they were actually eating, and he was generally well liked in the neighborhood. Thank you for sticking around until the end. If you found yourself hooked, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you have a story you'd like to hear read aloud, feel free to send it my way. Stay safe and keep the lights on.